How do we know that zoo animals are kept in adequate conditions? How do we ensure that their behavioral, social, and psychological needs are actually met? Today, I invite Isabella Clegg, founder of Animal Welfare Expertise, which is an animal behavior and welfare consultancy for zoos, aquaria, and other companies. Her work has been covered by the BBC, New Scientist, and she has given a TED Talk on how studying animal welfare can teach us about our own happiness. Let's jump right in.
Welcome to the Ecochat podcast. In each episode, we chat with experts in conservation, animal welfare, sustainability, or environmental science to learn how you and I can make a difference for the planet. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Let's start with, what's your mission?
For me, it really is enhancing animal welfare and specifically using science and evidence to be able to enhance animal welfare. I guess you could say there's different ways that everyone can go about improving animals' lives, but the strand that I've taken through my career and also my passion is using these sort of new tools and techniques, which are mostly coming out of universities, and applying them in practice. So in zoos or on farms, even for like policy and government projects to try and improve the lives of animals.
You mentioned applying science to practical use. So is there a disconnect right now? And
Yes.
what's the problem you're trying to solve?
Yeah, I think there is. And I know that's not rocket science. There's a disconnect in quite a lot of other applied science areas. But I feel like here, I think the first thing to say is that in terms of what the problem is, it's still very difficult to define animal welfare. The best scholars in the world sometimes don't agree on how to define it. At the moment, the most sort of well accepted definition is that it's a balance of positive and negative affective states. You can also replace that with positive or negative emotional states, kind of the same thing. It's basically all based on how the animal's feeling. So are they having roughly more positive feelings, experiences, affective states in their lives than negative, or is it the other way around? And once you can know a little bit more about that, you can start making decisions about whether a practice or a use of these animals is right or wrong. That's then the ethical element of it. But this first step of actually trying to find out what they're experiencing is this animal welfare science. And it's still quite new. So it started properly, the first sort of mention of it was in the late 1960s, but it only really started being, well established in the 90s, I would say 80s, 90s. And then that was in farm animals. So now when we're talking about zoo animals, which is a bit of my speciality, that really has only come in the last, 5 years, where we're applying some of these ideas about welfare science to the zoo. So yeah, in terms of the disconnect between the science and the practical, in that sense, in the zoo, there's really not much dialogue going on. So my work and a little bit of my research is trying to be that bridge between the two.
You mentioned a really interesting point there, which is it's really hard to measure animal welfare, to determine it objectively.
Yeah.
And you mentioned one standard way is to measure the balance between positive and negative states of the animal, like what they're feeling. But even that, to me, sounds really hard. Like, how do we know what an animal is feeling?
Yeah.
How does this all work?
Yeah, it is very difficult. And just to compare it to humans, because we're talking really, you could say the same thing about humans. How do you know what a human's really feeling? At least a human can talk and tell you things. It means they can also, cover things up and maybe subconsciously, not know exactly how they're feeling, but at least they can communicate. And obviously we can't communicate yet with animals. But the advantage of that is that sometimes you can say that animals are a little bit more true, I guess, to how they're feeling inside, in that, they're less likely to sort of cover it up. And a big component of animal welfare assessment, so that's trying to measure what they feel, is looking at their behavior. 3 sort of main axes, I'd say, are behavior, health, and cognitive, so the decisions they're making. But the behavior, obviously, that kind of is also linked to health and cognition in itself. So the behavior is the really key one. And so, in terms of assessing welfare, we've had to start getting really good at doing behavioral observations and analysis of those observations, so that you can pick out little indicators that, for example, happen in, if you study an animal for a few months and you find that this indicator or this slight subtle behavior only happens when it seems to be really stressed, you can start saying that we call it a welfare indicator is a reliable way to tell that the animal's not feeling good.
What are some of these indicators?
Yeah, of course. So some of them might be, you've got your abnormal behaviors. I mean, there's so many different ones, but to cover a few here, you've got abnormal repetitive behaviors. So those are your typical, when lots of people think when they go to zoos, and especially old and not some of the better zoos, you'll see in tigers pacing at the fence, or sometimes in labs you can see monkeys doing flips, really repeatedly, and that's a real failure to cope with the environment that they're in. So it is a form of stress, but they haven't found a way to kind of meet their needs or achieve that, I guess, motivation, the internal motivation. Say that they want to, a tiger, they want to walk around in the wild. They'd want to walk around their territory. They'd want to, make sure that they're maintaining their territory from other males. In a zoo, they can't do that, and so it's a sort of thwarted attempt to cope, and they then end up pacing around the boundary of a enclosure repetitively, and that's a good indicator that they're not coping very well. Other ones are more sort of acute stress behaviors, like you could have aggression, you could have fear behaviors, and these, even if we're talking about wild animals in zoos, some of these actually look pretty similar to what you might imagine in your pets, like your dog or your cat. So wide eyes, ear positions, are relevant in some animals. Sometimes hiding themselves or avoiding, like preference tests, or preferences or avoidance of certain things in certain areas are a really good indicator of what an animal wants and doesn't want. But the comprehensive answer to your question is that in order to assess welfare, we can't pick any one of those things and just say, oh, because it's showing abnormal behavior, it must be in poor welfare. You have to look at loads of different indicators together to be able to get this whole picture of that balance of positive and negative.
All right, so that's behavior, and we covered some of the signs that we can use to assess the animal's behavior. Now, what about health and cognition?
Yeah, health stuff is interesting. Again, in a slight sort of still a kind of disagreement, I guess, within the welfare science field, is that your sort of pure welfare scientists would say that welfare is only affected where welfare is only affected where the animal is feeling good or feeling bad. So health issues can only affect an animal when it has a sort of tangible impact on it. So, like if it's got a disease and it's making it feel sick, nauseous, lethargic, doesn't want to eat, then that is a welfare issue. However, if you've got, for example, an asymptomatic tumor, which it's obviously in the animal, it may shorten its life eventually, but at that point in time you're looking at it, it's not having any bad effects on the animal. It still feels very healthy, it feels good, it's doing all its normal behaviors. Technically, in welfare science, that's not having a welfare effect. So there's an interesting, another challenge with health issues is that we can't necessarily say that all health issues mean poor welfare, but we've got to try and look at which ones are actually making the animal show, and they kind of are grouped together, and they're called sickness behaviors. And they're very similar really to how humans feel when they're sick. Again, you don't want to eat, you're lethargic, you're tired, you don't really want to see anyone, you socially isolate. You've got sometimes headaches and tummy aches, so you might be holding your body, you might be holding your body in funny positions, which we can sometimes see with animals too. We can sometimes see facial pain expressions with animals, not all of them, but some of them we've got that knowledge about.
Very interesting. We'll go back to cognition in a second, but you mentioned that animals tend to display symptoms that are very similar to what humans would display when they're sick. So, for example, lethargy, social isolation. Does this only apply to species that are similar to humans? I'm assuming mammals. Or does this also apply to other types of animals like birds or reptiles, amphibians, etc.?
It's a great question. I think the social side of it, yes. That's mainly for social species, that they, they'll have a normal, they'll also be all different. So some animals will be more social individually than others, but they will show differences from their baseline. If they're feeling ill, they'll usually spend less time with their other members of their group. Sometimes though, and individually, it might be completely different. Sometimes I don't know if that happens with humans because I'm not like that, but when they feel ill, they really cling on to other members of their group. So that could also be one effect, and that's an interesting aspect of animal welfare science, is that you can study a species and even a group, but you'll also have individual differences in welfare. So it becomes really hard to make generalizations sometimes, or you always have to be careful not to make huge generalizations. I think you've got to do that, start general, and even for some species we have to start even more general than that. So like families, groups, taxon, higher up the level of the species orders, higher up the order level, because we don't know enough about individual species to be able to make those conclusions.
That makes sense. All right, so we covered behavior and health. What about cognition?
Yeah, cognition is really interesting and probably the one we know least about in terms of welfare science. So cognition, we're talking about how it interacts with welfare, is when decisions that an animal is making are impacting its welfare, and sometimes the other way around too. When an animal's feeling bad, it will also impact then the decisions it's making. So it's kind of a two-way thing. One aspect of it that I've been looking at is something called cognitive bias, which is, humans have this too. It's whether you make kind of more optimistic judgments or more pessimistic judgments of something that's ambiguous, that you don't know whether it will turn out good or turn out bad. And you have optimists that obviously are more positive about it, and pessimists that think it will turn out badly. And we can actually measure this in animals, and they found really interestingly that much more so than humans, I think, but still linked to a certain degree, that optimistic like animals are those that are in better welfare, and pessimistic like animals seem to be those that are in poorer welfare. Whereas with humans, there's a bit more of a personality level difference, which has an impact also on how you make those judgments. But with animals, it seems to actually be quite a good measure of welfare itself. So that's one aspect of how you can use cognition to understand animal welfare. And then there's other much more, invasive neurological kind of research you can do, like to work out what an animal's welfare state is. And sadly, quite a lot of it has to be post-mortem, because you're looking at brain structures, you're looking at, even like sort of length of telomeres, and there's lots of different new exciting areas of neuroscience that I'm not too familiar with, that I just read about, surface level, that we're trying to work out, is an animal's brain structure, does that differ if it's had a good life versus a bad life? And we're still in kind of the early stages of that. But yeah, my specific interest, I think, with cognition is how it affects behaviorally the animal.
Very interesting. Can you give me an example of how you would measure optimism versus pessimism for, let's say, a tiger, or you can choose whatever animal you want?
It's a great question, because it can be hard. So I've done a study with dolphins, and so we tested it with them, but I'll use an example of a dog because it's easier to imagine. But if you have a dog in a room, for example, the first step is to train it, that if you present a bowl on one side of the room, say the left side, it's always going to be full of food. And if you present the bowl on the right side of the room, it's always going to be empty. And you do one or the other again and again over a series of trials. And if you can imagine, dogs are clever enough, but this would work really with any animal. They learn that when it's on the left side of the room, it's going to be full. So they start running to the left. And when they see it's on the right, they walk slowly there because they kind of know it's going to be empty. And once you see that difference in speed, you can then present the position right in the middle, kind of if you can imagine a semicircle with an arc. So no difference in distance between those bowls and the dog. That bowl is in the middle of the room, and so the dog doesn't know whether it's going to be full or empty. It's equidistant from both. And an optimistic dog would run towards that middle bowl, hoping it's going to be full, and a pessimistic dog would walk slowly, expecting the worst, thinking it's going to be empty. And that's something called judgment bias. There's a few different types of cognitive bias, but that's one way to test judgment bias in animals, and you can adapt that kind of a test to loads of different species. So that's exactly the one that I did with dolphins, but it's been done, in lots and lots of different animals.
Okay, so it would be a similar setup for dolphins as well?
Yeah, exactly.
Of course, it would be underwater instead of on land?
Yeah, so we used a target, and we used fish, where it got a big fish on one side of the pool, and it got actually no fish on the other side, but just eye contact and applause from the trainers who it has a good relationship with. So it's kind of positive, but not as positive as the huge fish.
Got it. Going back to your original mission statement, you would like to apply this science, this animal welfare science, to zoo animals. So why focus specifically on zoo animals?
I don't know exactly why I personally ended up there. I think it's one of those things. Yeah, I never had it as a sort of goal of mine, but I ended up there through. I did a master's in marine mammal science, so that's whales and dolphins, and then a PhD also in dolphin welfare assessment. So I think that's the way I guess I ended up with zoo animals. But maybe now that I can reflect on it, it works very well for me because I think I really find it interesting, a big diversity of species. And of course, in zoos, you get that. And I also find it really interesting to pair this kind of welfare science with the public debate around zoos. I think that's also really interesting, is how people's perceptions of zoos are obviously changing. Zoos themselves are changing. Some of them, I think, are becoming really great centres for conservation and education. Some of them are kind of still stuck in the past and are not good enough in terms of welfare to be, very honest. And so it's exciting, I guess, being part of that, movement, I think, hopefully towards better zoos and using that welfare science to also communicate to the public what they're seeing in the zoos.
You mentioned there's a disconnect between animal welfare science and what's actually applied in real life on the ground. So how can we bridge this gap?
So one way, I guess, the way that we do it is having experience in both industries, so a leg in both industries. And we're the team that I work with has all studied in university, so we're able to read these papers and the findings coming out of scientific papers and digest it down, boil it down, and kind of package it and help the zoos implement it on the ground. But sometimes, you don't need that third party, us in the middle. You don't need that bridge. You can have, keepers and caretakers of zoos or of anyone, of farms, of laboratories, anyone who's working with animals can start reading scientific papers and pulling out bits that they think are applicable to them. Not saying this is an easy job, and of course this is usually on top of all the other animal care stuff they have to do, but luckily more and more it's becoming recognized as an important part of their jobs, which means that the top managers of all of these facilities are allowing their staff to dedicate more and more time to understanding welfare science research and applying it. So I think that's already heading the right way. But for people who look after animals, that's one way you can start understanding welfare science, is to read some of these papers. And yeah, I think the other part of it is potentially using all the sort of technological tools we have at our disposal at the moment to either gather more knowledge or apply it on the ground. So in the past, if you wanted to do a behavioral observation on an animal, you might have to use paper and pen, then you'd have to enter the data, then you'd have to analyze it. And these days we have, digital platforms that allow us to, and I mean, I'm still, having my eyes on the animals, still logging the behavior in this platform, and it then, orders it for me and allows me to analyze it. But I'm sure soon in the future, we'll be able to have, autonomous observations of these animals where it will, obviously they'll take lots of footage and it will analyze it all for us and spit it out and say, these animals are spending this amount of time doing this, that. So I guess, being up to date with technology, I would say, is also a good one to do.
Yeah, I think these AI tools will definitely come out in the near future.
Yeah.
And there's already a ton of them that can, for example, summarize scientific papers and spit it out in an easy-to-read format.
Yeah.
I've recently heard of an AI that has been trained on facial recognition of individual animals, so that's super exciting.
Yeah.
I think the intersect between AI technology and how it can be applied to animal welfare is super interesting.
Exactly. I think you're right. And I think that's another example of where it's much further along with farm animals, because obviously there's also like way more farms, way more data to train these models, whereas zoo animals, it's not quite there yet. And, we've got lots of different types of animals that the programs have to learn how to categorize. But yeah, it won't be long.
Going down this rabbit hole of AI, do you know of any projects that are being conducted right now on like classifying animal behavior?
No, I don't. I mean, I know a lot of auto detection projects that are going along, definitely. So, for example, there's one on polar bears. I know a couple of dolphin facilities that are doing it, but of course, that's slightly difficult with dolphins, is that you have to contend with the water surface. You've got usually cameras above the surface that are trying to detect dolphins that sometimes go below. So there's a little bit more effort that's needed with that. But no, in terms of, the other side of it, how else can AI help us with welfare assessment? For example, I reckon compiling lots of different types of data and giving a sort of holistic evaluation of it could be something that AI could help us with. I know some people who are very early stage thinking about how that might be, but I guess always with AI, the difficulty is if we're not experienced enough in how we're doing these welfare assessments, and by that I mean it's still quite early days of doing these welfare assessments. It's quite hard to train an AI program to do that. So I wonder whether we need a few more years of experience, on the human side of it before we're able to train an AI model to do it.
Right, that's true. Like to train a model, you need to feed it both the data and the answer.
Yeah.
But if we don't know the answer, for example, if we don't know what the animal is thinking or feeling, then it would be challenging to actually train a model.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, going back to implementing these animal welfare science changes on the ground in zoos, can you give us some case studies where, you applied some recommendations and it has really improved the welfare of the animals there?
Yeah. What would be the best one? I think something which topic close to my heart would be something called enrichment, which is basically anything you can do to challenge the animal cognitively and environmentally. So especially for animals that are kind of have more advanced cognitive abilities, like your elephants, dolphins, apes. What kind of puzzles, games, foraging activities can the keepers give to them each day that will get them to be really engaged with their environment and spend a long time kind of looking for their food and like they would in the wild, basically. And it kind of sounds, I don't know if it sounds simple or not, but it's pretty difficult in practice, especially, for example, with dolphins, where you're talking about having to provide those things underwater. But I think through these, for example, assessments that we've done, and I guess from experience of how best to set up an enrichment program like that. So how often should you apply it? How often should you change it? Who should do it? How do you record it and analyze it and evaluate your program? So, for example, some of the zoos I've helped or we've helped put in a new enrichment program for, we can see real changes in the animal's behavior. So they spend more time looking for food. They then spend less time looking for humans, which is a really important one. So although it might seem like it's a good thing if you have your zoo animals that, like the humans enough, or the keepers or the visitors to watch them, we don't really want that. We want them to be behaving like animals and, exploring their environment and interacting with each other. So when you see, increases in behavior of interacting with their environment or being social, or maybe sometimes even increased breeding success and less time waiting for the keepers to arrive, that's a really good sign that you're doing the right thing. So yeah, we've had a few examples of that with dolphins and seals, and a few other species too. So that's always really rewarding.
Can you explain what exactly is enrichment, and what are some examples of enrichment that you've added for dolphins, for seals, for apes, etc.?
Yeah, of course. So enrichment, as I was saying, is those any activity or device that you can give an animal to make it more interested in its environment, um, or increase that foraging behavior. And by that, I mean something, for example, that hides the animal's food within it. So you could think of something like, they're called puzzle feeders sometimes, but and you can have them for dogs. They're sometimes like Kongs, where you have a structure, a ball maybe with a few holes in it, and you put the animal's food inside it. So it's just a little bit harder than just giving the animal the food straight away. It has to roll the ball around, or you know move something so that something gets released so that they can then access the food. And so they're engaging their brain a little bit to work out, how can I get that food out. The difficulty is that as I was saying, with the more cognitively advanced animals, they'll learn that pretty quickly and it becomes quite easy. So you have to keep varying the challenges and the puzzles and the different objects so that they don't find it too easy, basically. So some cool ones for dolphins are, they've got lots of these different puzzle feeders. You can have lots of different shapes with holes in it, and you can put them so they sink underwater, so that the dolphins have to go down and nose around with their rostrums. That's what their noses are called, or their mouth, sorry, to find these fish that you can put in it. There's loads of other ones too. So you can get them to have a kind of maze where they have to move something along down the maze to be able to then, if they get that to the end, then they can the fish will be released. So it's kind of like a challenge. You can give them like multi-step things where, for example, you leave different, for example, weighted objects around their pool, and you have a box where if you put a certain amount of weighted objects, a trap door will release and the fish will be released as well. So again, you can teach them step by step how to access the fish, but they will eventually learn that they have to go around the pool collecting all these weights, put them in it's kind of like a vending machine, put them in the box, and then their fish will be released. And the same principles you can do with all other animals, so apes too. And I mean, apes are, as we know, super cognitively advanced, so you can have this and much more complicated mazes that they can play with to access food. Sometimes not even to access food. There doesn't always need to be about foraging. Sometimes promoting tool use. So we know that some of the chimpanzees will use, for example, the termite fishing. They'll use sticks to get termites out of a mound, and so part of it is making a fake termite mound, putting little bugs inside, giving them the tools somewhere else in the enclosure, and allowing them to show that natural behavior.
It seems like quite a complex system to implement. You mentioned, for example, you need to switch things up frequently.
Yeah.
So would this only be feasible for zoos which have adequate funding or resources or personnel? And then what about zoos that lack these resources or bandwidth?
Yeah.
What can they do?
Yeah, you're totally right. It definitely is. And I think, again, interestingly, we can bring in technology here and start thinking about automation. And I know this is an initial outlay, an initial cost for enrichment. But for example, if we can have, automated feeders that will, automatically release the food if the animals, do this, and this, but you have them all set up around the enclosure, lots of different types, and you can remotely turn on, which ones are active, that will be loads of variability for the animals and takes away that keeper time to keep on removing, putting in these different items, putting in the food, and that, I think, is what the most expensive and time consuming thing is the keeper time. So I'm hoping that with more technology and automation, some of this will become easier, but it's certainly a challenge for smaller zoos. And one way they can get around this is to partner with universities and students who are often doing really cool projects or want to do cool projects of building or developing enrichment, applying it and measuring the results. So I'd suggest that to anyone who's thinking about lack of funding, is try to partner with people, that you can have a mutually beneficial project.
Is there any funding or program that can help out zoos in need? Because I'm just thinking about the zoos in developing countries.
Yeah.
I've been to some of them and they're pretty run down.
Yeah.
And the animals there are pretty miserable as far as I can tell. It
Yeah.
seems like the limiting factor for them is they don't have enough resources to provide
Yeah.
enrichment, to provide, enough care for
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
animals, and that's why the welfare conditions are so low. So yeah, I was wondering, like, what can we do to help these zoos out?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great point. And I think, yeah, they're lacking in funding and resources, but they're also lacking in, I think, in the knowledge side of welfare science. So I think you'd have to go at it from, which of course is partly funding, but you'd have to go to, you couldn't just, give them some of these items. You'd have to also teach them how to use them, for the animal's best interest. But I think there's not one centralized fund, but things that I've heard of working really well, for example, are like Amazon wish lists, where, for example, a zoo in a developing country could put up a wish list of different enrichment items, and people, do a campaign, and people, from the other side of the world can buy them and see them being given to the animals, which is, I think that's always worked really well. And especially, everything has to be leveraged by social media these days. And I think that would work really well also as a social media campaign for a zoo if they could offer that to their animals. Um, I think there's some industry associations in developed countries that would also potentially provide funding for developing countries to develop their enrichment programs or their welfare programs. But that's again, certain associations will offer that, some don't. Um, but yeah, I think in general, I think education and knowledge is kind of the starting point for a lot of this, because at the same time, people do tend to focus on like the cost of enrichment, but actually some of the most successful enrichment I've been part of implementing is can be always like upcycled materials, recycled materials, fire hose, so the discarded or not used anymore fire hose that fire stations don't need anymore is an amazing material to make, climbing structures or um, even feeder toys or any kind of, like, it's very tough and durable, of course, and you can also like punch holes in it, thread it together, really, really versatile. And there's actually a few companies out there that are um, showing people what they can do with all this. There's loads of different actually enrichment companies who have some free resources online. So that's another way that developing countries could um, develop their programs. But yeah, I would say to for those zoos there, it's also, once you start getting that knowledge of welfare science and and want to implement enrichment, it's actually pretty easy to find the materials. They're sort of plastic, and although not always, this is another debate about whether we should use plastic as enrichment for zoo animals. Some people say no because it doesn't look natural, but at the same time, as we know, plastic is discarded everywhere. It's also really tough and durable, and that's what you need sometimes for these big, these big animals that are like polar bear that's going to just destroy anything that's not tough enough. So I would say, especially for zoos with the lack of funding, try and use discarded materials, obviously that are safe for the animals, but making your own enrichment can be done that way.
All right, we mentioned education, knowledge, funding, and resources. Are there any other noteworthy factors that you think are limiting zoos from providing their animals with adequate welfare conditions?
A good question. I think nothing really off the top of my head. I'd say it's a bit of a nuanced one, but I think public opinion is starting to be much more important than it was in the past, and maybe that's a result of social media access. Really, I guess that everyone can maybe see what's going on and share it with the whole world at these different zoos, which of course is a really good thing in some sense. But on the other hand, can, I guess, drive zoos to do some things more than others. So, for example, I can see a lot of anthropomorphic, so making animals seem like they're humans, basically. Like doing a birthday party or for a penguin, or making a cake or doing a Halloween thing for a tiger. I don't want to slam that because I think it's fun um and it can be great for the animals. I just think that shouldn't be the only type of enrichment that is done. That has to be in addition to all of this other effort behind the scenes, usually, where you're making all these challenges and devices for the animals. And of course, yeah, post the pumpkin on Halloween but also make sure that you're doing all of this other stuff. And again, like I said before, it's great social media content to watch. Watching a chimpanzee fishing for termites in a zoo is, what more could you want? Like that's basically like going and seeing them in the wild. People, I think there's a bit of an old school thought that zoos don't really want to show their behind the scenes or show too much because they're worried about they'll get criticized, and understandably, because activist groups are criticizing them. But at the same time, by not showing really what's going on, they're losing their main weapon, which is that they have amazing animals that we can see amazing behaviors, that we can see them doing amazing behaviors. So I hope that that's a sort of aspect of future zoos, is really showing the public what goes on in the best possible light.
Do you think species with large territories in the wild, for example, tigers or orangutans, dolphins, should they even be kept in captivity?
That's a good question. I think I would take dolphins off that list. They don't tend to have that big of a kind of a home range. They tend to be residential, but you can have some cetaceans that do migrate. Some killer whales do, which aren't technically dolphins. But that's one way. That there has been a few papers and research saying that yes, maybe size of territory is a really good indicator of how well they do in captivity. But I do think since that research, which was kind of about 10 years ago, we've realized that there's a few other things that definitely will also make a difference. And it's not always that territory is a good indicator. Tigers, surprisingly, although we do often see them pacing, they can do really well in zoos. But then other species like polar bears, who also have huge ranges, really don't seem to. So I think there are other aspects going on. And I think again, kind of back to what we talked about with welfare assessment, and you can't take one aspect and say that this will make them do well and do this won't. You have to look at a few different things. So I think I would say that doesn't mean to say that there aren't some animals that shouldn't be kept in zoos or can only be kept in captivity if you spend a huge amount of money on it, and that usually isn't feasible for a zoo's business model. They can't have enough money from visitors' tickets to be able to spend on the money. But some projects, and I'm thinking about dolphins here, because some projects are funded by governments. So, for example, a few dolphinariums in different countries are closing down, and people are wondering what to do with the dolphins. And some governments are funding, or even big companies are funding, projects where the dolphins go and live in seaside. They call them sanctuaries. Now, this costs a lot of money, and it's not as well set up for visitors to go and visit, so you won't get the income enough to support the sanctuary from that side. But if you have a big backer like a government or a big company, that might be feasible, and that might be the only way you can keep that animal. I don't agree with it fully with dolphins. I do think you can keep them in the traditional non-seaside sanctuaries in good welfare, but I think, as I said before, it's really hard. You definitely it needs a lot of money spent on it, and I'm sure that's the same for a few other species.
Got it. We talked mostly about mammals, so are there any knowledge gaps in terms of animal welfare science for the other types of animals like birds, reptiles, fish, etc.?
Yeah, of course, definitely. It's inevitable that we started with mammals and things that are closer to us. So there's loads of gaps with other species. There's also great research starting to come out. And again, like I was saying, you can apply the principles of welfare assessment across different species, which sounds crazy, but you can look at those basic things like sickness behavior, body condition, social behavior, aggressive behavior. You can apply that and find the different thresholds within different species. So we are learning a lot of transferable things from one species to the other. But there definitely needs to be more done. And I'm very conscious of that in the work that we do. So we're trying definitely to make sure we prioritize other species as well. For example, we're launching a new campaign to find some bird enrichment ideas. And we've done some assessments recently of, a species of Asian wild dog that is really not got much welfare research on it, but we still want to do a welfare assessment to start that ball rolling and give it some visibility.
Are there any noteworthy, interesting findings for some other types of animals in terms of their behavior or welfare requirements that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'm sure there are. I'm trying to keep ahead of all of this research because there is lots coming out. I saw a paper the other day that was saying that individual preferences in fish welfare apparently are very important, potentially more so than other species. That's something I wouldn't expect. You always think of fish as part of massive shoals, but maybe it is that individuals are more different to each other than we think. Um, and yeah, there's definitely some on amphibians. We posted the other day about a new paper that's looking at amphibian welfare that found a few different indicators that aren't present in mammals, obviously, like a state of torpor where they go down kind of into shutdown mode, which mammals don't have. So definitely.
I'm also curious about the policy side of things. So are there any like minimum requirements on how to house a certain species at a zoo?
Yeah, it's a great question. That really, really differs by country. But in general, I would say it's not as specific as you might think. Probably just because there are so many species that zoos keep that you know lawmakers haven't had enough time, I guess, to develop guidelines or regulations for each species. So, yes, there are some, for example, for dolphins or for apes. Um, Sadly, the US is notoriously a bit outdated in its regulations. The last time that your Animal Welfare Act was updated, or when it was really when it was launched in 1966, I think. So there's definitely updates needed. But even you've got the EU bloc that also doesn't have. It lets each country come up with its own regulations on zoos, and then within that, they've got to come up with their own stuff on each species. So actually, what zoos mostly rely on, I think, is industry bodies. So, like voluntary organisations that are groups of zoos, for example, that have clubbed together and come up with the best practice guidelines for space, for what you feed these different animals, and that's what is mostly followed. And some of them are also accreditation bodies. So, to be part of it, you have to go and undergo an accreditation, and an inspector comes around to check that you're following all these things, and that way you get to be part of the industry body. So yeah, I'd say it's a bit more. Yeah, governments aren't yet really the leaders in this, I don't think.
What are some of the certifications or logos that we as visitors should look out for?
Yeah, well, that's a great question because I don't think that there's a really that many that are visible to the public. They're there, but you have to go looking for them. So you've got the AZA for the US citizens. You've got or US, sorry, people who live in the US. You've got the AZA, the American Zoological Association. So they do a really, really high level accreditation inspection for their zoo. So if you can see a zoo is a member of or accredited member of the AZA, that's a really good sign. I think they say, if I'm not wrong, I think it's about 10% of their zoos pass their accreditation first time or something. So to me, that it's quite a good metric. Over in Europe, you've got other things. There's one called EASA, European Association of Zoos and Aquariums. You've basically got one of these industry bodies, and definitely in all developed countries, and also for sure in some developing countries. So you might have to go and look what the name of that is, and then see if the zoo you want to visit is accredited. But there should be one in most countries. And then there's some other kind of third party ones. So again, in the US, there's American Humane, which is doing started to do some zoo accreditation programs. So you could look for that. Personally, I'm not sure how stringent that one is. I think it's a little bit less evidence based, but at least they're probably a bit more visible to the public. But I think there's actually a big gap there of labels or signposts for the public to be able to find a zoo, and whether they're a good quality one or not. So we know we have lots of these kind of labels for food. You go to a supermarket and you can see that you're buying free range eggs or good welfare beef, or those kind of things. And I think we need that for zoos.
Right. And so there's no global certification standard for zoos?
No. American Humane is doing it globally. They're based in the US, is mostly assessed in the US, but they are going to other countries. But it's only been going a few years, the zoo program. But yeah.
Got it. Let's say I'm an average Joe. I don't know anything about animal welfare or legal stuff or certifications. I'm just visiting a zoo on my vacation. How do I tell if that zoo has adequate animal welfare standards? Is there anything that I should look out for?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say with that, the interesting point is that acceptable is going to differ for everyone. So what you find acceptable might be different to what I find acceptable. But if we say roughly, and we can go back to our definition of welfare here, that we want the animals to overall be experiencing a more positive life than a more negative life, which I think is quite a reasonable place to start. You should be looking for things like we've talked about already in terms of, is the animal exploring its environment, or is it sitting, waiting and looking for keepers, or is it pacing, along the fence? Is it interacting? If it's social, is it interacting with the other animals, and how is it interacting? Is it doing it positively, or can you see them maybe fighting? In terms of health, we talked about that sickness behavior. Is it on its own? Is it looking lethargic? Is its coat looking dull? Is its body condition looking bad or good? Interestingly, I think people, understandably, can get quite a good sense, quite holistically, without even thinking. You can look at an animal and you can kind of tell whether it's looking basically happy or not. If there is any doubt, try and think about whether what it should be doing in the wild, and is it doing anything close to that when you're watching it in a zoo. Of course, zoo environments are different to the wild. They're never going to be the same, and that doesn't mean, which some people think, that you can never have good welfare in a zoo. You can. It's quite hard to do. So don't assume just because it's in a zoo it definitely is miserable. It might be behaving slightly differently to the wild, but not, as long as the key sort of drivers for those behaviors are the same. And by that I mean, if we know an animal, for example, likes to, like we were saying, forage for termites, we know that it does that in the wild. Is it doing that in captivity? Okay, it might not be doing it in exactly the same type of termite mound, or it might not be hunting for exactly the same insect, but if we can see it rooting around, getting out some kind of food, then that is the same kind of behavior that we're seeing. So same category of behavior. So yeah, I would suggest trying to do a little mini welfare assessment yourself. Try and cover behavior, health, cognition a little bit. See maybe whether I mean, that will be a hard one, but maybe whether it's I don't know, kind of taking risks and investigating things, even if they might not have a good outcome. And yeah, then you can kind of make a conclusion, I think.
Okay, let's say I go to a zoo and the animals look miserable to me. They're pacing around. They're obviously bored, or they show signs of depression.
Yeah.
The conditions are filthy.
Yeah.
What can I do to influence the zoo to improve the welfare conditions for the animals?
Yeah. I think I would say you've got a level of kind of chain command that you could do. You could start with just reporting it to the zoo itself. That might be quite difficult and they might not like you doing it, but I would always start there. They're, after all, the ones that are going to be very sensitive to visitor feedback. So if you can do a feedback form, tell them what you saw and why. The next step up, I think, would be reporting them to a local authority. That will definitely differ in each country, and that might not be available in all countries, but have a look, quick Google, put animal welfare reporting in the country you're in. So for example, in the UK, you can do the RSPCA. I'm not sure exactly. I think you've got a few different bodies in the US. And then the third one, and I'd probably only do this after I've done those other two, and maybe you don't think you're getting any movement or traction, you could go to social media. You could take a video of it and post it to social media if you're brave enough, if that's the way, that you are okay with interacting with the world, because as we all know, it has great power in kind of forcing change. I think the danger with that, and we've spoke about it already, is that you might misinterpret something. So I would warn, I'd make sure you're very sure that you're seeing some bad welfare conditions. And by that, you could have an animal that's clearly looking very sick, that isn't eating, that can't stand up or something, or is in a tiny enclosure. I think if that was me and I might post it on social media, and you might get then some kind of campaign or at least support for improving the conditions of the animal. But I would definitely suggest first, feeding back to the zoo and trying to go to the reporting channel for your government.
Got it, got it. Your work of applying animal welfare science to zoos is obviously very commendable. If our listeners want to contribute to this cause, what would you advise them to do?
Yeah, also great question. And just to say, I know we've talked a lot about zoo animals today. We do work with policy and standards and sometimes welfare assessments of other animals too, because luckily it is quite translatable. Once you have a set of standards for zoo animals, they can be applicable with a few tweaks to other animals too. So it's for anyone, yeah, interested in other animals. But you can support us definitely by well, first of all, I guess you could give us a follow on our social media. That is always, again, a good way to support people these days. And through that, you can learn more about our different like campaigns and other ways to support us. So one thing that we do, we have a Patreon channel where you can sign up and subscribe to us for, there's different levels, but it can be as little as $1 or £1 a month. And for that, you can get we give you in turn access to different tools that you might find useful. So again, we were talking about knowledge. We provide, for example, we provide reference lists for scientific papers that you can access for free. We provide loads of seminars, recordings, so that you can learn about animal welfare topics. So hopefully we're thinking that that's a way to have a mutually beneficial, relationship. You can support us and we can support you. And then otherwise, if you can also do a sort of one-off donation to us if you want. That's on our website. Which I can either provide the details for, or you can link, I guess, after the podcast.
Yeah, for sure. I'll definitely add any resources you mention in the description or the show notes of this episode.
Yeah, great.
I'm also curious to hear your origin story, because it's not every day that you suddenly decide, I'm going to start this consultancy to help zoos out and apply animal welfare science. So, yeah, how exactly did you come up with this idea, and how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, so how I got here was I started off wanting to be a vet. I guess a veterinarian, as most people, I think, who are interested in animals when they're young, they think, the only thing to do is to be a veterinarian. And then I realized that the bit that really interests me was the behavior side, not so much the cutting up animals. So I went first to university to study animal behavior, but it had this add-on to the degree. It was called animal behavior and welfare. And I wasn't so into the welfare. I just wanted to do behavior. But when I got to the university, which was a really great, center for welfare research, I found that animal welfare was this fascinating new kind of topic that encompassed everything, encompassed the vet stuff and the behavior and cognition. And it was really kind of taking off. This would have been 15 years ago. So that was really exciting. And I then moved a little bit into marine mammals. I think probably inspired by one of my lecturers who was into that too. So that led me to do a master's in marine mammal science at the University of Miami. Again, a really great university for this topic. But interestingly, they didn't really cover much animal welfare science. They were just looking at marine mammals in the wild and in captivity, but from a sort of health and training point of view. And so when I was doing sort of the end project, I proposed to kind of match the two together, this animal welfare science and marine mammal science, and make a welfare assessment for dolphins in captivity. And that then led on to my PhD. That was when I lived then in Paris for a bit and developed that much further with a dolphinarium there. And I guess this is a long-winded way of answering your question, but after my PhD, I realized that I didn't really want to do more research and I wanted to work on the ground, but there weren't any jobs for anyone who wanted to apply sort of welfare assessments, especially for zoo animals. So I thought I would give it a go as a consultancy, which is what we are. And yeah, haven't looked back. I especially love definitely the diversity of projects that we get to do, which I don't think is possible in other traditional jobs. And of course, there's definitely been difficult times. That's I guess just what happens when you're sort of running your own business. But so far it's been brilliant.
Nice. Do you have a North Star goal of where do you want to take your consultancy in 5 years or 10 years?
I don't really, which is funny because I'm quite organized and I like thinking about strategy, but I don't have a sort of, I want to employ this many people or have this much global reach. I think sounds very trite and cliche, but I want to keep on helping as many animals as possible. So just keep on increasing that kind of impact. And if that means that we, maybe employ more people, or maybe it means that we, I don't know, change from zoo animals to another area, maybe more policy stuff, because that tends to impact maybe more animals. I'm not sure, but I just want to keep improving the way we're doing things, keep engaging. I'm really enjoying engaging with people through Patreon and the sort of public outreach side of stuff that we do, and I guess see where we go.
Nice. Well, I definitely wish you the best of luck with that. Now, from your years of experience and work in this field, if you can distill it down to 3 lessons or call to actions that you'd like to share with our audience, what would that be?
Yeah, I would say that number one, I think science can really help us in terms of making objective evaluations of animal welfare and focusing on that evidence-based thinking. I know in other industries and areas of life, we also want to usually follow evidence-based thinking, and it's the same here. We don't want to just think about animal welfare subjectively, like I think this is good and this is bad. We want to look at the evidence. I'd say number 2 is that to remember that although it seems like animal welfare is kind of focused on health indicators traditionally, and that, for example, animal vets are usually the ones that have the final say on animal welfare, we're now realizing that, of course, there's actually much more to it than just health. And that is kind of similar to the change that you see with human mental health becoming now obviously much more widely recognized than it was in the past, where we only looked at physical health of humans. And then the last bit I would say is that we've talked a little bit about it, but just be aware that not just zoos, but any kind of facility or organization that use animals, they vary widely in terms of how they're managing the animals and their impact on welfare. So if you're wondering about whether something is good for an animal or not, it's probably not going to be a black and white answer of this is bad and this is good. You might have to look within, for example, farming to find which maybe meat or eggs are good welfare, or which zoo provides good welfare, or all of these different things, which sports maybe are better for welfare than others. And I know that's not an easy answer, and people in today's world want a yes or a no, but I think it's worth having a little dig and finding what you think might work for you in terms of what you think is acceptable.
Very insightful. Well, Isabella, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on.
Thank you, Sam.
Please hand off to the audience where they can contact you or learn more about your work or any other resources you'd like to share.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you for having me. It's been really great. And you can find our website is www.animalwelfareexpertise.com. You can contact us on there if you've got any questions about what I talked about, or if you want any, scientific papers or anything. You can also find some of our different projects and campaigns, like I was saying, about bird enrichment or dolphin enrichment, and find out there also about if you want to become a Patreon, like I was saying, to access some of those tools and subscribe. And of course, we've also got social media channels. I think Sam will link them, but it's Animal Welfare Expertise on Facebook and Instagram. Those are probably the main ones.
Nice. I'll add all of these links in the show notes or the description below, so definitely check that out. That's it for this episode of Ecochat. If you enjoyed this content, please remember to leave a rating and review in whatever podcast platform you listen to. This really helps the show get promoted by the algorithm and get shown to more people. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll meet again next episode.